So today we're going to do part 3 of the 1920s politics and finish it up. And we're going to be focusing on the Herbert Hoover administration. So starting off with the election of 1928. In 1928, Calvin Coolidge has served out his second term, and he is ready to retire. And so the Republican Party will nominate Herbert Hoover. If you remember, he has made a name for himself as part of the Food Administration during World War I, and then during the Coolidge administration, he was the Secretary of Commerce and Labor and made associationalism, so he's very popular with business. The Democrats are going to nominate a man by the name of Al Smith, whose nickname was the Happy Warrior. Al Smith was a very controversial figure in 1928. He was a New Yorker, which is not going to play well with the people in the South. They don't trust people from the North, so already we're seeing that he might lose some Southern Democratic votes. He's Catholic, which a lot of the farmers in the South and the West don't like. We've talked about the conservatism of the 1920s, and he's also against prohibition. He is openly in support of drinking and getting rid of the 18th Amendment, and which also is not popular with people down south and on the farm. And so we have a very controversial candidate, popular in the North, but not popular in the South and the West in the Democratic Party. And in fact, for the first time, we're going to see that radio plays an important part in the political process. So the first time we see technology having an impact on politics in America, because Al Smith gets on the radio and he has a thick New York accent. And that certainly is another thing that turns the people in the South and the West off. They see him as this, this East Coast immigrant Catholic guy that they just don't have anything in common with and they don't trust. So here's the election returns. You can see it is a resounding victory for Herbert Hoover. America is in a Republican's frame of mind. They certainly want to be pro-business. And so even the South, who always votes Democrat, we see a lot of the southern states for this election turn and go to Herbert Hoover because it's not really a vote for Herbert Hoover, but it's a vote against Al Smith. He's just too Catholic, too wet, too much of an immigrant, too East Coast for a lot of these farmers in the South and the West. And so we see Herbert Hoover becomes the next president of the United States as a result. We call these Democrats that are going to switch parties, they have a special name for this election. They're called Hoovercrats instead of Democrats. Because for this election, they're going to turn, like I said, for Herbert Hoover. So right after Herbert Hoover gets elected, right when he was running for office, the economy was amazing. It was booming in 1928. But then when he takes office in 1929, just a few months after he takes office, he's unfortunate enough to have the stock market crash. Now, this certainly was not Herbert Hoover's fault, but he's the president when it happens, and so people are going to blame him for it. If you remember, we talked about this with Martin Van Buren. Andrew Jackson did a lot of things that was going to cause a panic, but Martin Van Buren is the president at the time, and so he is going to be blamed, so a little bit of a synthesis there. So on October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashes. We can see it as this downward, sharply downward angled trend on the graph up above. But this is a little bit deceiving, this graph. If we were to actually go into a little bit more depth on this or more focus, there were warning signs in 1929 from about September on that the stock market started fluctuating. It started to have some days of dropping, and then it would rebound because people thought, well, the good times will always last, and then it would drop and rebound again. So there were some warning signs before, but on October 29th, 1929, it is apparent that the drop is so sudden that this is not just a market correction, a warning, this is an actual event. And so people start to panic. Because if I have bought on margin, right, we have talked about that before, if I went and borrowed money, a lot of money to pay for stocks because I thought it would always go up, well, if it's apparent that the stocks are not going to go back up, but they're going to keep dropping, well, then I'm in a world of hurt because I have overextended myself. I've overdrawn on my credit. I've went and borrowed money from all of these people to buy stocks, and I know that I'm not going to get my money back. So what I have to do is sell as many stocks as I possibly can so I can cover my losses. And so buying on margin is going to make the stock market crash worse. It certainly isn't necessarily going to be the cause, but it is going to make it worse because all of these people are just in debt, and the only way to get out of debt, the only way they have to get out of debt is to sell the stocks they have. So it's this avalanche of everybody selling at the same time. And if everybody's selling at once and nobody's buying stocks, the price drops and drops and drops and drops because there's just a big supply and no demand. And so we see that the market just day after day after day, it just keeps crashing, and nobody can see the end in sight. Fortunes are going to be lost all in one day. Millions and millions of dollars would just disappear. We invest all of this money in the stock market. Let's say I bought a stock for $5,000 a share. Now the stock is worth absolutely nothing because nobody wants to buy it. And I have to sell it because I bought on margin. And so we see the stock go down to, $500 a share to $100 a share. And you just keep lowering it, hoping somebody will buy your stock. But nobody does, and so now it's pennies on the share. And we see that fortunes just disappear overnight. The United States is in a serious economic downturn. So what are the causes of this? Well, one of the causes, just like we talked about in the panics in 73 and 93, was overspeculation. Everybody was investing in the stock market, and they weren't waiting to see, what they were investing in. I'll buy stock in this company, but do I know anything about it? No, it doesn't matter. The stock price will just undoubtedly go up. And that was people's attitude in the 1920s, that always stock prices will go up, and they never actually stop to see what they're buying. So over-speculation, over-gambling in the stock market. Next, there was absolutely no government regulation of banking or business. If you remember, we had talked about before in the 1920s, it was a very conservative time, very pro-business, and so we stopped regulating the business industry, and so businesses were free to lie to their investors watering stock. And so no wonder this crash happens, because these companies are starting to struggle. They can't sell as much as they used to, but they just keep lying to their investors and say, yeah, everything's good, everything's good. And so when people finally wake up and realize that these companies, they just can't hide the lie anymore. And so we see that this will be a cause of what making it crash so big. Right. Next, as we had talked about Andrew Mellon's tax policies and the tariffs, is that the middle class consumers just run out of money. Now, they actually ran out of money earlier in the 1920s, but because we have this credit where you can go and you can borrow money from a bank easily in the 1920s, and so people were just borrowing money so they could keep up this spending spree. Advertisers are convincing them that you need more goods, and so people just kept buying and buying and buying, and the economy was being driven by consumers, and so when the consumers run out of money, the middle class, the big consuming class, because of high taxes, if you remember Mellon's tax policy, and because of high prices, because of the tariff, eventually there's just nobody left to consume, and so the stores can't sell anything. They tell the factories, look, we don't need any more shipments. The factories start to lay people off. And then finally the public finds out about these factories starting to falter. The businesses can't lie about it anymore. And then we see the crash. So all of these things are working together to cause the biggest stock market crash in American history. And then just like back in the 1870s, again, we see overproduction. And this goes into underconsumption. The factories just keep churning out goods, but we don't have a middle class to sell to anymore. They're out of money. And then finally, we see this lack of international trade. Now, let's say American factories, they want to sell to Americans, but they run out of money. Okay, we've overconsumed. And so, well, what about selling to the British or the English or the French or any of their colonies? Well, we can't, because when we put up our high tariffs in the 1920s, England and France and Germany and all those other countries did the same thing to us. And so it's kind of a tariff war. And so when they put up their high tariffs, now we can't let no foreigners can buy our goods because they're just too expensive. And so this international trade breaks down, making the panic even worse because now there's no customers anywhere. So let's talk about the Depression. So now that we've talked about some of the causes of the Depression, let's talk about its impact on people. There was a tremendous feeling of shame among Americans at the time. If you are a factory worker and you've lost your job because of something not your fault, the economy was shutting down. It's not because you did a bad job in the factory, the factory is shutting down. And so men at that time, the cult of domesticity kind of works two ways. Women are supposed to stay at home and take care of the home, and men are supposed to go out to work and support the family. Well, if a man loses his job, society kind of considers him not really a man anymore. He's not a father. He's not a good husband. And so men would feel this tremendous shame, like they lost their job and it must be their fault. And so there are many instances where husbands would continue to go, quote unquote, to work even though they had already lost their job, but they didn't tell their wife this. They didn't tell him that they had lost their job. And so the wife just sees her husband, like always, go off to work. She says, is this depression hurting us? He said, no problem. He doesn't want to admit that he's lost his job because it's shaming. And so he goes off to work and he looks all around town and nobody's hiring because the economy is doing poorly. And so he comes back and she said, how was your work today? And he says, fine. Meanwhile, they're eating through whatever savings they have. And then he goes off to work, but now he has to go to the next city to find work because there's no work in his city. And then he tells his wife he's on a business trip or whatever. And then he comes back a week later and she says, everything fine? Yeah, everything's fine. And then he has to keep going out to these further and further cities, and he stays away longer and longer and longer. And for many of these men, they just can't come home and continue lying to their wives, or look to see, the electricity turned off because they can't pay their bills, or to see their children go hungry. And so a lot of these men just never come home. And so what we see that it splits up families, and we see this large population of thousands of men riding the rails, looking for work from town to town, and they can't afford to buy a ticket on the train. And so what they do is the train starts to pull out of the station. We see all of these men come out from hiding spots, and they try to jump on the train in an empty box car or something like that. And so we see thousands of men just aimlessly riding the rails looking for work, or maybe they're not even looking for work anymore as the depression continues. Maybe they've just given up and they're just riding the rails because they don't know what else to do. Now, at the time, we called these people bums or hobos, but it's a very sad experience for all of these men and families as they're being split up. So we talked about families being split up, and so let's talk about this picture. It's a very famous picture from the Great Depression. It's what we call an iconic picture. It represents the Depression. This woman here, her family has lost their farm. We'll talk more about the Dust Bowl in a minute. But they've lost their farm, and so they packed everything they have onto their truck. And they're going from Oklahoma to California looking for some kind of a farm-related job. Maybe they can pick lettuce or tomatoes or something. And they're in kind of a desert area on their way to California. And the car runs out of gas. Now, the family has no money for gas. They don't have any money for food either. And so this picture was taken as this woman is sitting on the side of the road. And you can see the worry in her face because her husband has left. And he's been gone for several days. And they're in the middle of a desert. And she's got her 3 kids with her, including an infant. So you can see in the picture. Notice it's all dirty. The children are scared. Dad hasn't come back. They're dirty. They're hungry. And the mom has this worry on her face that what if my husband doesn't come back? How am I going to feed these kids? And so the photographer, when they stumble upon the scene, they take this picture, and it represents the face of the Depression. People worried about their next meal, and will their husbands come back, and will they ever see them again? And, are we going to die? So people are certainly worried about their lives in the Depression. It's a very tough time for many Americans. As a result, we see families start to become smaller and smaller. Obviously, if you're a married couple, you're not going to bring a kid into the world if you can't feed it. And so we see families make the conscious decision to have fewer children, dropping the birth rate. In addition to that, people start to put off marriage. So marriage rates goes down because how can I marry a woman if I don't have a job? I'm not able to support her. And so we see that the Depression has a real impact on family structure and family dynamics. So next we see this song from the 1920s. Now this song is going to kind of represent the age. It is about a hobo, and he is riding the rails, looking for work, looking for a place to find a job, those kinds of things. So what we're going to do is we're going to play this song. I just want you to listen along.
One evening as the sun went down and the jungle fire was burning, down the track came a hobo hiking, and he said, boys, I'm not turning. I'm headed for a land that's far away, beside the crystal fountains. So come with me, we'll go and see the Big Rock Candy Mountains. In the Big Rock Candy Mountains, there's a land that's fair and bright, where the handouts grow on bushes, and you sleep out every night. Where the boxcars all are empty, and the sun shines every day on the birds and the bees and the cigarette trees, the lemonade springs where the bluebird sings in the Big Rock Candy Mountains. In the Big Rock Candy Mountains, all the cops have wooden legs, and the bulldogs all have rubber teeth, and the hens lay soft-boiled eggs. The farmers' trees are full of fruit, and the barns are full of hay. Oh, I'm bound to go where there ain't no snow, where the rain don't fall, the wind don't blow, in the Big Rock Candy Mountains. In the Big Rock Candy Mountains, you never change your socks, and the little streams of alcohol come a-trickling down the rocks. The brakemen have to tip their hats, and the railroad bulls are blind. There's a lake of stew and a whiskey, too. You can paddle all around them in a big canoe in the Big Rock Candy Mountains. In the Big Rock Candy Mountains, the jails are made of tin, and you can walk right out again as soon as you are in. There ain't no short-handled shovels, no axes, saws, or picks. I'm a-going to stay where you sleep all day, where they hung the Turk that invented work in the Big Rock Candy Mountains. I'll see you all this coming fall in the Big Rock Candy Mountains.
And so as we see from the song, this is the life of a hobo, and he's just singing about his life. He's looking for soft-boiled eggs. The song itself, the Big Rock Candy Mountain, he's looking for a place that we see sweets and candy, and you can sleep out every night, and the barns that you're sleeping in are full of hay. He talks about riding the rails and the boxcars being empty, and we had seen that in a lot of towns when these hobos, these men looking for work or just riding the rails, came into town, they weren't welcome. The police would arrest them. They arrested them for vagrancy, and they would sick the dogs on them. And so that's why he talks about a jail made of tin, and you can walk right out. And the bulldogs have rubber teeth, so you won't get bit. And so we see a song of real poverty here. And so this guy is trying to talk about happier days. And so we see it is a very difficult life for many Americans. So next up, we have, continuing on with this topic, let's talk about unemployment. Now, unemployment numbers in the Great Depression are staggering. Estimates vary. It could be anywhere from about 25% to 33%. During the last recession America had that we're coming out of, unemployment was bad. It was maybe 10, 11%. But now to have a quarter to a third of your workforce out of work, that's staggering. There are no factory jobs, and if you get fired, you can't find another job. You can't feed your children. And so some economists say that this number is actually even misleading by that. It's actually a little bit small. Unemployment, so these are all people that are out of work, but that number doesn't include all the people that are underemployed. What that means is people that have had their work hours shortened, or the amount of days they're working in a week shortened, not because they want to stop working, but because the factory is just giving them a half shift instead of a full shift. It also doesn't include all of the people that have just given up looking for work. And so we see this number could be quite a bit higher, especially for minorities. We have seen that perhaps for minorities, African Americans in the North, that the unemployment rate may have been as high as 50%. This is staggering numbers. Half of your population of men can't find work. And for the simple reason that if you're a white owner of a factory, which most of the owners were, just because of racism, you're going to hire white people instead of African Americans. Or if you have to do layoffs, you're going to lay off African Americans first, so they're last hired, first fired. And so we see another one of these iconic photographs of the Great Depression. We see all of these African Americans standing in line for a free lunch. Somebody, an aid organization, is handing out soup and bread. and they're all lined up so they don't starve. And then there's a poster left behind from a billboard left behind from the 1920s saying world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way, as this white family is enjoying it with their new consumer car. And then we see all these African Americans just trying to survive. So as tough as it is for white Americans, it's even harder on African Americans. So we have this thing called an economic downward spiral. And so when the Great Depression starts, factories are laying off workers because they lost all of their capital in the stock market. Consumers aren't buying anymore. And the biggest expense of any corporation is always labor. And so we see to cut costs, to stay in business, factories will lay off shifts of workers. So they lay off the workers, which means now we have fewer consumers. If people are getting laid off, they can't consume. So if we have fewer consumers, that means people aren't buying things. So what do the factories have to do? Lay off more workers, which of course leads to less consumers. And so we see factories shut down, less consumers, more factories shut down. And it's this downward spiral that Americans, we just can't figure out how to stop the spiral. How do we start to create more jobs and more industry? It seems hopeless. And I think that is the word to kind of think about in the Great Depression, is hopelessness. So more about its impact on people. We have here, a modern city in the background of the picture, but in the foreground, we have all of these things called shanties. They are little homes that are made up of whatever you can find in the garbage. Pieces of plywood, little pieces of leftover corrugated steel, maybe trash, and you put them together and you make a home for yourself. Because these people have all been evicted from their apartments or from their houses, they lost their mortgage, and so we call this a shanty town. Now, people were very angry at the government because they blame the government for this, they blame Hoover for all of this, and so they will sometimes nickname it a Hooverville to try to say, Hoover, he's the cause of all of this. We live in a very poor area that it's just basically a tent city. And so we see these Hoovervilles popping up all over America as people are just basically camping out trying to survive. Next, we see also people say that they have a Hoover flag. If you're walking around and you have no money in your pocket, you reach in to pull out some money, you pull it out, all you see is the lining of the pocket just sticking out of your pocket. And so they called that a Hoover flag. If you had a Hoover blanket, let's say you can't even build one of these shanties. And so we see lots of homeless people, and what they do to survive the cold nights is they get some leftover jacket that they could find, and they start shoving newspapers in it, crinkling them up, or trash, or straw, and your coat becomes your blanket, and so it's called a Hoover blanket, trying to survive so you don't freeze to death in the night. So all of these things are going on in the city, but what about the countryside? What's going on in the countryside during the Great Depression? Well, unfortunately, at just the time we have the Great Depression, there's also a major drought going on in America, one of the worst droughts in recorded history, and it's hitting the most strongly. It's hitting what would we call the western Midwest. You can see it on the map here. Western Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, the Dakotas, Nebraska, eastern Colorado. The purple area is where we see that this drought is the worst in the panhandle of Oklahoma. And this is called the Great Dust Bowl. It's called the Dust Bowl because there's such a drought that all the crops die. And when the crops die, there's no roots to hold the soil in. And so the wind blows constantly on the Great Plains. And it takes up all that dirt, that dust, that is no longer being held down, that soil. And we see these huge dust storms roll through town. And if you can imagine, you can even die from this. We see these farmers, they haven't seen rain in years, and this huge cloud of dust comes rolling in, and you better find shelter, because this is what, on the right-hand side, we see this big dust storm moving in. On the left-hand side, we see what has happened to a home and a farm after the dust has rolled in. It looks like the Sahara Desert. Cattle die because they just can't get enough oxygen to breathe during the dust storm. Houses are covered up. Cars are covered up. And of course, you can't grow any crops on this. So we see now that farmers pack up and leave Oklahoma, leave eastern Colorado, looking for someplace else that they can feed their family. And if you remember back to that picture of that woman in the desert with her kids, she was an Okie. She was one of these people from Oklahoma looking for a better place to live, a job so they can survive. So to make matters worse, we certainly see things are very bad for farmers in Oklahoma, Kansas, and the Dust Bowl area. So we talked about internal migration, mostly going to California, looking for better farmland, looking for farm jobs. So what does the government do about this? What is Hoover going to do to relieve some of this suffering? And at first, he does absolutely nothing. He believes that this is not a depression. He can't see into the future. He thinks it's just an economic correction. And he tells Americans that what we have here is a crisis of confidence. And he tells them that good times are just around the corner. He says, look, Americans, don't panic. Just go out, and the reason factories are shutting down is because you're not consuming anymore. And so he tells Americans, just go consume. Take some of your savings, go out and buy a new car, buy a new house, buy a new dress, buy a new dishwasher. And he believes that this will reverse the downward spiral because people will start consuming again. And he says that that's all we need to do. You're just lacking confidence in the economy. Be a patriot. Go buy a dishwasher. But people aren't going to do that. They're not going to do that because they know that this is worse than what Hoover thinks. And if I have savings, I'm going to hold on to it. I'm not going to go buy some consumer good that I don't need. And I need to feed my family. And so we see Hoover's early response is just to say that this is not a big deal and go consume more. It's an absolute failure. So the next thing he does is we pass the Hawley-Smoot tariff of 1930. This is understandable. We think, okay, so what can we do to get Americans to buy consumer goods again? And so we think, well, a tariff. Let's raise the tariffs even higher. And so this is at an all-time high. And so Americans raise their tariff even higher to try to force Americans to buy American-made goods, hopefully putting factories back to work and factory workers. But when we do this, European countries, again, respond in turn. So they put up their own high tariffs, which makes international trade basically just stop. So the economy gets actually worse as a result of the Hawley-Smoot tariff. Then Herbert Hoover goes back to his old idea of volunteerism. If you remember, during World War I, he was in charge of the Food Administration, and he got Americans to voluntarily give up consuming food to help the war effort. And so he said, well, you know what, I bet that'll work now in the Great Depression. And so he goes to businesses and he asks them, look, why don't you guys, instead of laying off workers, why don't you just cut their hours or cut their wages? That way, even though they won't be getting as much money, they'll still have some money rolling in, and so they can support their families. Then he goes to unions, and he says to unions, look, the economy's really bad. It's not the factory's fault. Please stop going on strike. So take a no-strike pledge. Now, of course, this is not going to work either, because if you're a business, you need to stay in business, and the best thing to do that is to lay off workers. And so businesses are not going to follow this Hoover's voluntary plan. They're going to say, no, we have to stay in business. We owe this to our shareholders. And so they will lay off workers, and so they ignore Hoover. Unions, they know that their workers don't have enough money to live because wages keep going down. And so what is unions' only strategy? It's to go on strike. And so we see that unions ignore Hoover's advice because it's not in either the businesses or the union self-interest to listen to Hoover. So his first response is not very effective. Then what he does do is he does create the Federal Farm Board. And so this organization is created, and it's supposed to be a go-between between banks and farmers. He knows farmers are suffering, either because the Dust Bowl or because people just can't afford to buy the farm goods. And so the Federal Farm Board is created to create very low-interest, cheap loans to farmers. He figures if we can reduce their mortgages, maybe they can stay in business and they can keep farming. But farmers, this doesn't help farmers. Now, in the populist era, this would have been amazing. They wanted cheap loans. But things are so bad in America in the Great Depression that farmers, even if you reduce their loan, they still can't hold on to their farm because nobody's buying farm goods. They just don't have the money. And so we see farmers look to Hoover and they say, well, thanks, but that's not a good idea. What do I need another loan for? If you want to forgive my loans, if you want to get rid of them, that's amazing. Then I can, hold on to my farm. But I can't have another loan. I can't pay the one I have, even if you reduce the mortgage rate, the interest rate. I can't afford that. So the Federal Farm Board does not do a lot to help the Depression for farmers. The next thing he does is he does do some large government construction projects, some public works projects. The theory here is that if the United States government builds dams or roads or bridges, that money will then go to construction companies who will then put people back to work. And this is a good idea. This is when Hoover Dam is built. So it's a very large construction project, and it does put thousands of workers back to work. But the problem is Hoover isn't willing to do this in large enough numbers to have a real sizable effect on the economy. And so while it's a good idea, it's just a drop in the bucket. Next, so members of Congress promote a bill called the Muscle Shoals Bill. It is an idea to take the success of the Hoover Dam project and just make it much bigger. And so instead of building one dam, we will build 10, 15 dams, putting hundreds of thousands of people back to work in the construction industry. And what we're going to do is we're going to dam up the Tennessee River in the state of Tennessee. Basically, it would put a whole state back to work, the state of Tennessee. And so it's the Muscle Shoals Bill, but one other thing that it would do, it always help consumers, because not only would we create construction jobs, but these dams would be generating electricity, and the government would own these dams. And so now the government would be in the electricity producing and selling business. And so now consumers would get really cheap electricity because the government doesn't need to make a profit. And so they can give electricity to customers cheaper than private corporations can. But this is vetoed by Herbert Hoover. He says, look, a few construction projects are fine, but I don't want the government to go into debt to pay for all these projects, and I don't want to go out and just give people jobs. He says he believes in self-help. He believes that people should go, get their own jobs, because if the government just is the solution to everything, then the people will depend on the government in the future, and they won't be hardworking Americans on their own. And so he thinks it'll ruin our character. And so he vetoes this bill, but he also vetoes it for another reason, is he says it's socialism, and it is. The government will be in the electricity producing business, and it'll force private electric companies out of business, and he doesn't want to go down the socialist road. And so we see that he has his reasons for vetoing these bills, and so all of these people in Tennessee, they just continue to not have jobs and have a tough time putting food on the table. Next, we're going to go to the Depression worsens. And so Hoover's response, his early response, is not effective. And so as we go through Hoover's term in office, we go to 1931 and then 1932. The Depression just keeps getting worse. The stock market just keeps dropping. More factories keep shutting down. Unemployment keeps rising. And so as people become more desperate, they start to do more desperate things, more radical things. And so we see protests become more radical. One example of this is farmers. We know that they are certainly suffering. They've been suffering actually before the Depression. We talked about them suffering in the 1920s, and this is just another decade of bad conditions for farmers. And so farmers are so desperate that they think, well, we have to violently protest. And so in Iowa, states like Iowa, but especially here, we'll give this example, is farmers don't think that the government is listening to them. They're not paying attention to them. So the farmers in Iowa, they put up roadblocks into the major cities of Iowa, so no food can get into the major cities. So they think well, ever since the Roaring '20s, we see that the cities are where all the political power is, the cities are where people care about, and so if we block off the food into the cities, now the politicians have to pay attention to us because the people in the city will be starving. And so we see that we see people putting up barricades now in the United States. This is getting pretty radical. Now we see that the National Guard of Iowa will come in and take the barricades down, but the idea is that we're not just talking anymore. Now people are starting to take action. They're desperate enough to get angry and not quite take up arms, but we're headed down that road. Next, we talk about the Bonus Army in 1932. If you remember from our previous set of notes, we had the Adjustment Compensation Act. all of those veterans who fought in World War I, they wanted the government to give them a pension to make up for the money they lost while they were fighting in France, and so that pension was supposed to start in 1949. But if I'm a veteran, I can't wait for that pension to come in 1949. I'm starving now. I can't feed my kids now. And so there's a movement among these veterans to get their pension early. And so thousands of veterans join together and they march on Washington, D.C. They go to Washington, D.C. and they want to talk to the president. They said, Mr. President, give us our pension now so we can feed our families. And the president won't even meet with them. He believes, again, he's a conservative, he believes that the government should be small and they shouldn't be in the business of helping society. That business can do that, certainly. People should help themselves. The government should not hand out food and money to people because then we won't be rugged individualists anymore. If we look to the government to solve our problems, we won't solve our own problems in the future. And he says, I don't want to ruin America, Hoover says, by temporarily aiding people, and in the long run they're not going to be help themselves. And so he doesn't even meet with them. And so the bonus army is what we call these group of veterans. They refuse to leave Washington, D.C. until they get to meet with the president. And so they set up a shanty town right outside of Washington, D.C. that we see here. And they say, look, we're peaceful, but we are just not going to leave until the president talks to us. Well, the president won't talk to them, and he thinks that this looks bad. Especially it's an election year, 1932. We can't have all these homeless veterans starving, outside of Washington, D.C. And so he orders the Washington police and the United States Army to go bust up the shantytown, to break it down. And so we see here a picture of the police and the army, and they are going to burn down the shantytown. Now, the veterans don't want this to happen. So if we see in the picture on the left-hand side, we see a veteran, he's grabbed a piece of a pipe or something, and he's about to do battle with the police. Another guy right in the middle of the picture is throwing a brick at a policeman's face. We see the American flag symbolically falling down. And this is very embarrassing to the country to see the United States government attacking veterans, burning down their shantytown. People died in this attack. And we see now we have violence on the streets of our nation's capital. So things are getting very serious in the United States. Violence is breaking out. Do we have a revolution that might occur? Might there be a communist takeover as the people get so desperate they turn to communism? So communism is on the rise, by the way, because people are desperate, and so is fascism. The Nazi Party is growing in America as people get desperate, and so America is on the eve of something radical, and it's an election year, and people are desperate to have things change. So the Depression worsens continued. So it is an election year, and Hoover realizes that he doesn't stand a chance of getting reelected if he doesn't do something. So his earlier attempts to fix the Depression aren't working. So as the people get more radical, Hoover loosens his conservatism a little bit. He realizes he has to do more. And so in 1932, he creates the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation is the federal government, and what they're going to do is they're going to loan money to private industry, to banks, to railroad companies. And so let's talk about the banks. Many of the banks in the Great Depression go bankrupt. They had invested heavily in the stock market in the 1920s, and when the stock market crashes, the banks lose all of their money, and so we see tremendous amounts of bank failures. The people who invested in those banks put their life savings in those banks. They lost all of their money too. So there are lots of bank closures in the United States, and without banks, going all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, America just can't function. Banks loan money so people can start new jobs, new businesses. And so we need banks to be strong again. And so the RFC, what they're going to do is the federal government is going to loan banks money so they have money in their vaults again at a very low interest loan. The same thing they're going to do to railroad companies, construction companies. They're going to say, look, a railroad company, we know you don't have a lot of money. There's not a lot of railroad freight being moved right now because nobody's buying anything. And so here's some money. Why don't you go build some new track, putting people back to work? Why don't you, buy new engines and boxcars that will put people back to work in factories to make those? So it's a good idea. The government is going to try to kind of jumpstart the economy by loaning money to corporations and banks. But this goes nowhere. It is not very successful. If you are a company or a bank, you need more help than just a loan. You say, well, thanks, Mr. President, But what do I need? Just like farmers, what do I need another loan for? I can't pay back the loans I already have, and now you're offering me more loans. If you want to give me the money, fine, I'll take the money. But another loan does not help me because I can't pay it back. I have no customers. I'm not doing any business. And so we see very few banks and companies take advantage of these loans because they just don't want more loans. So it doesn't go very far. So jobs are not created. The next thing he tries is the Emergency Relief Construction Act, the ERCA of 1932. So the federal government once again is going to give out loans, and they're going to give out loans to states. And so how this might work is the federal government will come to Colorado, and they will say, all right, Colorado, we know there's a lot of people not working in your state, so here's $10 million. I'm just making that number up. Here's $10 million. Why don't you guys use it to build new hospitals and schools and roads and bridges, and that will put people back to work. It'll create jobs. But most of the states in the United States say no to the loans. For the same reason that farmers did, for the same reason that banks and corporations did, is the states are already in debt, and they don't need more debt. And they say to Herbert Hoover, look, if you want to give us money, if you want to give us what's called a grant, just give us the money, we'll take it. But we can't take another loan. It doesn't matter how low interest the loan is. And so, again, we see that the loan program doesn't work. Next, we see the help for labor. Okay, so we see workers not working, and unions are having a tough time, and so we see the Norris-LaGuardia Anti-Injunction Act is passed. It outlaws yellow dog contracts in the workplace, and so this is a victory for unions that no longer can employers say that you can't be in a union if you join our company. It also recognizes unions' right to strike, which we had recognized before, but we had done away with in the 1920s. It also limits the use of injunctions on strikes, which we had done in the Progressive era, but during the 1920s, remember, we brought the injunction back. So this act is meant to be as help for labor unions, so they can go on strike, so they can get better wages for their workers. So this is going to be a big deal in the long run, but it's not going to help that much in the 1920s. So let's take a look at the big picture for Hoover and his attempts to fix the Depression. If you notice, most of these programs we've talked about, to farmers, to states, to private industry, they all hinge on the idea of loans. Herbert Hoover just cannot get himself to hand out money free and clear to farmers, to banks, to states. Once again, it's because of his self-help ideology. He believes that America was made great because people, rugged individualists, they went out, they worked hard, and they made their own fortunes. And he doesn't want to ruin that. And he believes that if the government just comes to the rescue and hands out money to people, then they're never going to work hard again. They're going to expect the government to come to their rescue. And so in a time in America when we certainly needed to put people back to work, we see that Hoover's efforts, and he does do a lot to try to fix the Depression, but he just can't get over his self-help ideology, and these loans are just not working. So that's his domestic policy, and we see that he is not successful in ending this Depression. It's just too big. So let's talk about what he does with his foreign policy. Now, if you remember, the previous two Republican presidents are isolationists, and he is certainly going to be an isolationist as well, especially because of the Depression. He figures Americans don't want to get involved in any other wars because we have our own problems. And so America is going to be even more isolationist than it was earlier in the 1920s. And so we can see this of what's going on in the world. In the 1920s and 30s, Japan, their economy is also struggling, and to get out of it, they believe that they should build up the military, putting people back to work, creating jobs in factories to build more tanks, and go invade other countries. Now we have markets for raw materials. So Japan takes a much different approach than the United States. They take a militaristic approach. And so in the 1920s and 30s, Japan starts marching with their armies, and so they invade Manchuria, part of what is China. Now, the world community at this time, if they would have stood up to Japan and said, you can't do this and we're going to punish you, Japan may have backed down. But the world is in a depression. America's in a depression, England's in a depression, Germany's in a depression, France, etc. And so the world, they don't do anything about this. Japan invades Manchuria, and there's really no response. The League of Nations is a very weak organization. The United States doesn't belong. Germany doesn't belong. And even the countries that do belong, like England and France, they may shake their finger at the Japanese and say, don't do this, but they're not ready to get involved in a war to stop Japan to do this. They have their own problems. And so when Japan invades Manchuria, and there's really no consequence, Japan is emboldened. Well, let's go invade Korea. Let's go invade the rest of China. And so we see that this is a problem. The U.S. doesn't respond, and we can see this in the picture. Japan starts invading other countries, violating the Nine-Power Naval Treaty that we talked about before, violating the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war, and some of these other ones that we had not talked about. And we see them just destroying these treaties, and the United States does nothing. Next, what about the United States and Latin America? Well, if you remember, the United States has been pretty heavy-handed in the past in Latin America, whether it's the bad neighbor policy, cowboy diplomacy, the Roosevelt corollary. The United States has viewed the Western Hemisphere as our hemisphere, and we are going to control what goes on. Well, actually, during FDR is pictured here, but Herbert Hoover actually starts this. Herbert Hoover says to the countries of Latin America, they say, look, we've got our problems here. We've got an economy that's in a shambles. We are no longer going to invade you. We're no longer going to enforce the Roosevelt corollary. We're no longer going to be a bad neighbor. So you guys can be on your own. And so we are going to be, quote unquote, a good neighbor. We're not going to invade your country anymore. And if you want to have whatever leaders you want to have, that's fine. If you want to talk to other European countries, that's fine. We're going to stay out of your business. Now, we will see that Hoover starts this, and FDR certainly continues this. We have our own problems, so it's the good neighbor policy.